The following program is a Town of Colonie television production of the William K. Sanford Town Library.
It goes all my life's a circle, sunrise and sundown. The moon rolls through the nighttime till the daybreak comes around. And all my life's a circle, but I can't tell you why. Seasons spinning round again, the years keep rolling by.
Long ago, near the beginning of time, there was only the lake and the sun. It was a quiet time. They enjoyed one another's company. Lake liked nothing better than to feel sun's rays upon her waters. And the sun took joy in that explosion of light and the reflection. But then one day a stranger came, standing off in the mist. And Lake called out, "Come, join us, share with us who you are." But the stranger didn't say anything. And she said again, "Who are you?" And the stranger finally said that he was loneliness. Well, the lake became agitated because loneliness would not come forward. And when the lake grew agitated, she did something which sometimes we all do. She took a nap. But her nap was not like your nap or Kate's or mine, because when she napped for 1,000 years. And during her nap, she had a dream. She dreamed that her body was filled with fish that were various shapes and sizes and colors. And when she awoke 1,000 years later, it was so. Her body was teeming with fish, and they roiled through her waters. And as the sun shone down on the lake, there was an explosion of light and color. Loneliness was enraged. He stomped forward, and he transformed himself into a serpent. And he thrashed his tail upon Lake's waters, and the fish swam deep into her depths. Well, once again, the lake grew angry, agitated, and fell into another sleep. And during this 1,000 years, she dreamt of the sky and those beings that we call clouds. And she dreamt that she was surrounded by a ring of peaks and mountains, and their slopes were crowded with trees. And when she awoke, that too had come true. She looked about, and for the first time she saw shadows that she had never seen before. And there was the movement of the sun across the sky for the very first time. And once again, loneliness grew enraged and swam deep into Lake's depths to hide from the light. The lake watched as the sun moved across the sky and the new shadows and the colors that she had not seen before, and soon the sun disappeared beyond the peaks and it grew dark. In fact, it was the very first night. She watched through the night, and loneliness rose up and thrashed upon her waters. But she remained curious to what she saw around her. And all of a sudden, in that direction we now call east, she saw a golden ribbon appear. And the sun once again appeared. And with the sun's arrival, loneliness swam again deep into Lake's depths. And so the lake experienced the first night in the beginning of a new day, and it's been that way ever since. Now, this story was given to me by Swain Wolf, the author who lives in Montana. And I asked him if he wouldn't mind my telling it, and he said that I'd be welcome to. But he wanted me to remember to share with everyone that loneliness is our ally, and not to define loneliness as an enemy. Because it was loneliness who really was the catalyst for Lake's dreams. And so loneliness played a part in that creation as well. And that we should embrace loneliness from time to time, because loneliness could be our friend. And that's how that story goes.
My mother and I shared a love of hokey things. Happily for us, Alberta, Canada, where she was from, has more large hokey tourist attractions per capita than any place on earth. And we visited quite a few of them. We'd been to the world's largest stalk of corn, the world's largest honeybee, the world's largest oil derrick, the world's largest cowboy boot, the world's largest beer can. We've gone to Vegreville, Alberta, and seen the world's largest decorated Easter egg. It's 75 feet tall, constructed of thousands of aluminum triangles and a few rhombi. It's an engineering marvel. It was dedicated to the centennial of the Royal Canadian Mounted Police. I'm not sure I understand the connection. We've been to Glendon, Alberta, where they have the world's largest pierogi. Now, you've got to imagine, there's a fork plunged into the ground, and on its tines, a giant potato dumpling. Now, while you're there, you might want to have a few pierogies and a couple of cabbage rolls. You can do that at the Pierogi Hotel. Or you could just go to the Chinese restaurant across the street, where they sell Canadian pierogies and Chinese pierogies. Now, I recently found out that there is a song created by the people of Glendon. It goes something like this. Pierogi in Glendon, come see, all a dumpling can be. I don't think it's going to make the hit parade, but I like it. Now, in Mundare, my mother and I had our picture taken beside the world's largest kielbasa sausage. Now, it's right next door to the meat processing plant. Imagine it. 46 feet tall, rises up like a... We won't even go there. Now in Drumheller, east of Calgary, it's right in the middle of the Badlands. And there are dinosaur bones that they've found all over the place. And they built a very prestigious museum, the Royal Tyrrell Museum of Paleontology. But the people of Drumheller worried that they might not have enough surefire tourist attractions. So they built the world's largest Tyrannosaurus Rex, 86 feet tall. I have walked up the stairs in its neck and taken pictures over its giant teeth. I also bought postcards in its butt. Now, by the time my mother reached 90, it was getting very hard for her to travel, but she still wanted to go places. But her heart was bad and her kidneys were bad and she was legally blind and her memory was shot. But my sister-in-law and I decided that maybe we could take her on one last overnight trip. We'd take her to Torrington, Alberta, to the world-famous Gopher Hole Museum. My mother was ready to go. She had her bags packed. We put them in the trunk and we hit the road. A couple of miles south of Edmonton, we stopped in Red Deer, Alberta to have lunch. My mother ordered the clam chowder. Now here's a bit of advice. Edmonton is pretty far from the ocean. If you go there, order the beef. But my mother ordered the clam chowder. And she's looking at that clam chowder, and she's stirring around. And she looks up and she turns to us and she said, "Girls, I can't find the clams." The waitress came over to fill our coffee mugs, and my mother said, "Miss, I can't find any clams in this clam chowder." And the young waitress said, "Oh, we never put clams in our clam chowder." My mother said, "I never heard of such a thing. No clams in the clam chowder." Well, I think that's just ridiculous. She says, "Down east, you can get a decent cup of clam chowder." She was still fussing about it. Several hours later, when we got to Torrington, home of the world-famous Gopher Home Museum. Now, I don't know what I was expecting from a gopher museum. I mean, I knew I was in the right town. We passed the giant 12-foot statue of Clem T. Gopher in the park at the edge of town, and I noticed that all the fire hydrants were painted to look like gophers. But the museum, was it going to be an expose of the life habits of the gopher? Or maybe the farmers' long battles against this varmint. Maybe the biology of the Richardson ground squirrel, because they're not really gophers at all. Well, I was not prepared for what I got. Now, if ever there was a museum that was politically incorrect, if ever there was a museum in bad taste, this was it. I gotta say, I loved it. Now, imagine hundreds of gophers stuffed, dressed, and posed, and placed in dozens of dioramas. Now, there was a diorama of a beauty parlor with a gopher beautician and gopher customers. There was a diorama of a church for gophers with a gopher minister and a gopher congregation. There were gopher cowboys and gopher Indians, gopher Royal Canadian Mounted Police. My favorite, though, was the diorama of the mayor fighting with the gopher hippie over a chipmunk. And the gopher hippie was carrying a sign that said G-A-G-S. Gophers against getting stuffed. Well, I thought it would be nice to have a souvenir. I was hoping for a t-shirt, something that said something like, "I survived the Gopher Home Museum in Torrington, Alberta." But they didn't have too much in the way of souvenirs. But the docent told me that I could read the guest book and maybe sign it. So I read lots of the entries in the guest book to my mother. It was amazing. People from all around the world who had come to this little museum in this small town on the Alberta prairies. I loved their comments. My favorite was the person from Eastern Europe who said, "I think it's just terrible what you did to those poor little rats." "Rats," my mother said. "They're not rats, they're gophers. You'd think a person could tell the difference between a rat and a gopher." I don't even think my mother was sympathetic to the plight of rats or gophers. She really wasn't that kind of woman. Well, the docent told us all about how they make the dioramas. Every winter, the people in town and the farmers from nearby, they decide on what new dioramas they're going to put in the museum. And they decide who's going to sew the costumes and who's going to make the scenery and who's going to make the furniture and props. She said, "We can't use roadkill." I thought about it a moment, and I thought, yeah, I understand that. Well, I don't think my mother remembered much about that trip at all. But one thing stuck in her mind for the rest of her life. And years later, she would tell the story over and over and over again. She says, "We went to this restaurant in Red Deer," she said, "and I ordered the clam chowder. And you know what? I couldn't find any clams in the clam chowder, and the waitress told me they don't put any clams in the clam chowder." Did you ever hear of such a thing? No clams in the clam chowder. Thank you.
A little girl lived with her mother in a cottage deep in the wooded area, kind of right on the edge of when the forest got so dark. And it was a summertime. It was a hot, muggy, sticky kind of summer. And one night, that little girl heard her mother tossing and turning and tossing and turning. And she got in her mind, "I'm going to bring my mother a drink of water." So in her nightdress, she went out the front door and through the yard to the great big well right there in the yard by the cottage. And she lowered the bucket down into the well, but it didn't splash, it just kind of went thud. And she knew deep inside, oh, our well has gone dry. So she pulled up the bucket and set it aside, but she really wanted to bring her mother a drink. And then she remembered how in the woods she would play with her friends, and they would go deep into the woods in the daytime, and they could take their dippers and have a nice drink from the cool spring that was always there. It never dried up. Her mother said it came from way up in the mountains and also from deep in the earth, and you could count on that spring. But of course it was night, so it took all her courage to take down that old tin dipper that was gray and kind of rusty and face the path and begin to walk into the woods. And it was so dark. Oh, the branches were pulling at her dress, and she could feel sticks and stones that she was stepping on, but she just kept going. And pretty soon, oh, it's like she could smell the spring and almost feel the coolness on her face. And then there it was right before her. She bent over and filled her dipper, and of course she was thirsty herself, so she took a great big splashy drink of the water, and it dribbled down her cheeks and her dress. And she sighed. She was excited to bring that drink home. So she filled the dipper again right to the brim, and then she turned and started back on the path. And she hadn't walked too long when she heard the sound of an animal. Oh, would it be a wolf maybe coming after her? And then in the distance she could just see the eyes first of, oh, it was just an old dog that she knew from the town. All the kids would pat his head and she felt safe. And the dog came up and was really thirsty, she could tell. So she put a little water in her hand and put it for him to lick. You could lick along with me if you want. Oh, he was happy, he wagged his tail, and because he picked up the scent of the water, then he went down the path and found more at the spring. Oh, she felt good. She had a story to tell her mother now, and she kept along the path, which didn't seem so dark anymore. And then she looked at her dipper. Why, that old gray tin dipper had turned to a sparkling silver. and there was a light coming off the dipper, and it lit the path. Oh, now she really had a story to tell. And down the path she went until she heard another sound. She looked into the woods. Who was that? It sounded like a human voice. Sure, there was the old man who was always talking to the children in the town. He'd pinch their cheeks sometimes and give them advice or tell them they were a cute little one. She liked him. And when she saw him coming closer, he said, "Oh, you got some water? Could I be having a drink?" She said, "Sure, it's for my mother, but sure, have a little bit, and then you can go back to the spring." And that's just what he did, taking a nice sip of the water and, giving her a little pinch on the cheek and a thank you. And she went down the path again, ready to get home and give the rest of the water to her mother. But again, when she looked, it seemed like the woods was going brighter. Maybe the sun was almost coming up, but no, the sky still seemed dark with all the trees around her. So she kept walking and walking, and soon she came right back into the clearing of her own house and went quickly up the steps and into the room where her mother was sleeping. Oh, her mother was deeply asleep now, but she had the water, so, Mother, wake up. I brought you a little drink of water." And the mother, who had been so deeply asleep, was a little startled to see her daughter there at her bedside, and all right, she took the dipper and began to drink it, not noticing that it had changed. And then, when she looked at the dipper, it wasn't that old tin dipper or the sparkling silver dipper, or the gold that had now turned since she gave the drink to the man, but it was diamonds. Diamonds all strung together in the shape of the dipper. The mother was so shocked, she kind of went, "Ah!" And the dipper lifted up, and it didn't fall back into her hands. It kind of drifted just across that room and out the window. And the mother, so surprised, looked at her little girl, and they held their hands and went to the window and looked out, and the dipper was rising up and up into the sky. And they just stood and looked at that beautiful constellation of stars. And you know, every summer, and even in wintertime, although you have to look at a different place in the sky, you can see that dipper. Maybe find somebody to go outside and look up at that dipper of stars. Oh, all over the world they tell stories about those stars and how they came to be. This is just one story. But when you see that dipper, see if you can remember this story of that brave child who, to do something nice, something friendly, something kind, went into the deep, dark woods and found that ever-bubbling spring of water.
A lot of the stories that I tell relate to beginnings and new beginnings, and this is another one of those stories that reflects on beginnings. Long ago, when it was dark, it was so dark that the earth was black and the sky was a dark midnight blue. There was an old man. He was making his way through the forest, half blinded by the limbs of trees. In one outstretched hand, he held a small lantern, and in it there was a candle that burned lower and lower. And with his other hand, he pulled himself along as though he were rowing through the great wood. The man, by the looks of him, had once been tall, but now his back was bowed as though he were carrying a sack of grain. His beard and hair were long and gray, matted, and filled with twigs and moss and grass. His nails were uncut, and the nail beds were filled with soil. His skin was wrinkled and furrowed and hung in furbelows from his neck and his armpits. Why, with every step the man took, the bones in his feet burned, and the joints of his knees screamed out to mock the call of the screech owl in the dark wood. The man labored. You could see his heart vibrating in his chest. You could hear his panting as he looked out into the darkness. And there in the distance he saw a twinkling light. And he thought, a hearth, a home, a meal. And he decided at that moment that he would make his way across the dark forest to the home. It took a very long time. He fell and pulled himself along, and soon he arrived at the cabin, just as his candle burned out. He pulled himself up the stairs and was about to knock on the door when he fell forward, pushing the door open, and he spilled onto the floor of the cabin. And there, near a hearth fire, there sat a woman in a rocking chair, knitting. She set down her knitting and she looked at the man. She had a long, thick braid that fell almost to the floor. She ran to the man and she picked him up as though he were her own child. She carried him back to the rocker and she began to rock him there, and she soothed his brow with her hand, saying, "There now, there." The night passed, and soon the midnight hour came, and the old man was gone. And there on her lap there was a young man, sleeping, fit and trim, blonde hair, cuddled up, and still the woman rocked. She rocked through the night, and it was almost dawn, and there in her lap the young man was gone, and there was a child, a little boy all curled up, his fist balled and held close to his chest. His cheeks were red, rouge-like. His hair was like spun gold. And the woman, she plucked 3 hairs from the child's head, and she cast them upon the hearthstone, and each of them rang out. And when the 3rd ring diminished into silence, the little boy woke up, rubbing his eyes. He had the bluest eyes. He looked up at the woman and smiled and slid down from her lap and made his way to the door. He turned back one more time as if to say goodbye, and he pulled the door open and he leapt into the sky to become the new day's sun. And so it has been ever since, a new beginning at the end of every night. Thank you.
Well, as Kate mentioned, I'm originally from Canada. I was born on the East Coast. But while I was growing up, we moved around a lot, up to the far north, out to the far west. Every once in a while, kids would say to me, "So, where's home?" And I wouldn't know what to say, except that I knew home was Canada. When I was a young woman, I moved to the States. And I love upstate New York. It's beautiful. My kids are here, my husband's here, my grandchildren are here, my friends are here. I don't expect I'm ever going to move. But still, if you ask me where's home, I'll say Canada. I think because I understand the power of home, that this story resonates with me so much. Here's my version of a Selkie story, the seal person. On an island off the north shore of Scotland, there lived a fisherman named Angus. He was a good man, a kind man, a decent man, but he was also a very lonely man. One day he went fishing, came home, and he was tired. And though he never usually did such a thing, he lay down to rest on the grass near the shore, and he fell asleep. When he woke up, it was already night, and the moon was high. And there, on the flat rocks near the shore, he saw women singing and dancing. Beautiful women, naked women. And he had never seen them before, but he knew who they were. They were Selkie. He had heard the old stories, though he'd never believed them. He knew that sometimes the seals, the great gray seals that swim in those northern waters, come ashore, take off their seal skins, and for a few hours become human. And then, after they dance for a few hours, they put their skins back on, become seals again, and return to the sea. But if you take away their skin, they cannot go back, and they must remain on shore as a human. Now, I told you that Angus was a good man, a decent man, a kind man, but also a lonely man. And he did what he should not have done. He took one of those skins and he hid it in the rocks, and he waited. And after a couple more hours, one by one, the seal women came and they found their skins, and they put one leg in, and they put the other leg in. They put in one arm and the other arm, and they tucked their heads in, and they became seals again. And immediately they dove back into the water. But one woman was left behind. And she came to him and she said, "Please, please, give me back my skin so I can go home." And he said, "No, no, I can't, I won't." And though she begged and pleaded and cried, he would not give her back her skin. So what could she do? She stayed because she had no choice. And she married him because she had no choice. And he was a good man and a good husband in every way but one. He would not give her the one thing she wanted most. Instead, he took that skin and he wrapped it up in burlap and he tied it up with twine and he hid it. And from time to time over the years, he changed the hiding place, hoping that she would never find it. Now they had 3 children, 2 boys and a little girl. And when he was fishing, she would take the children to the sea and they would play in the water. And never, never ever have there been children who loved to swim and dive as much as they. The only one who loved the ocean more than they was their mother. Well, one day they were down by the sea when the younger boy went back to the cottage to get a drink of fresh water. And he came back just a few minutes later and he said, "Mother, I've seen the strangest thing." Father was there, back from his fishing, and he was standing on the kitchen table, and he had a package that was wrapped in burlap, tied with twine, and he was there on the kitchen table putting that package in the rafters. Well, as soon as the boy's mother heard that, she didn't say one word. She ran back up to the cottage And as soon as she got there, she pushed the table against the walls. And she looked in the rafters until she found that package, and she pulled it down and she began running towards the shore. And while she was running, she was untying the knots. She was peeling back the burlap. When she got to the shore, she turned to her children and she said, "Come with me. Come back with me. Come to the sea. I must go home." She said, "I have another husband there. I have children there too. It's my home. I must go back. Come back with me. I love you." And the older boy said, we can't. No, we can't. Father needs us. And this is our home." And she turned to her daughter and she said, "Come back with me." And all the time she's saying this, she's putting in one leg and then the other. And her lower body is changing into the body of a seal. She's putting in one arm and then the other into that seal skin, tucking in her head. And her little girl didn't say anything. She just took one hand and put it into the flipper of her mother. And as soon as she did, the little girl changed also into a gray seal. And mother and daughter dove deep into the cold waters of the Atlantic. Oh, for a long, long time. The father and the two boys mourned for the loss of their mother and wife, for their daughter and sister. But they never came to shore again. But ever afterwards, when they went fishing together, two seals would come up to their boat, a large gray seal and a smaller one, and they would lead them to the place where the fish were plentiful. And then, large seal, smaller seal, would dive down again deep into the cold waters of the North Atlantic. Thank you.
It goes all my life's a circle, sunrise and sundown. The moon rolls through the nighttime till the daybreak comes around. And all my life's a circle, but I can't tell you why. Seasons spinning